Do you hate that woman, Geralt? My mother? No, Calanthe, I presume she had a choice. Or perhaps she didn't. No, but she did. A suitable spell or elixir would have been sufficient. A choice. A choice which should be respected, for it is the holy and irrefutable right of every woman. Emotions are unimportant here. She had the irrefutable right to her decision, and she took it. That's
Welcome.
just a quote from Sword of Destiny, from something more that we wanted to share at the start of the podcast for no particular reason.
Welcome back to the podcast surprise, everyone. While we are not a political podcast, I speak for all of us here that we believe strongly in a woman's right to choose. And
so does Andrei Sapkowski, as it turns
absolutely.
out.
Geralt of Rivia is pro-choice, and I don't know why you would not want to be on his team. So,
but with that said, we won't get too much into that. But obviously, we believe in women's rights to choose their own destiny. All right. Welcome back to the podcast surprise episode number 23. We're super excited to be here. We've been talking about this behind the scenes for a while, and with you guys. Blood of Elves, chapter 1. We're into the main novels. We, did the TV stuff for a little bit there. We, of course, did the short stories. Now we're getting into the main plot. Super, super excited to be here. How are you guys doing? Especially you, Michal. How are you doing today, my friend?
I'm good. It's summer. It's hot. I enjoy it. Some things are not as good, but you know what? Let's focus on the positives and make things better.
Yeah, like the fact that we get to talk about this great fun book series here tonight. That's certainly a positive, a good example of such. So, yeah, we're going to keep a familiar structure. If you're a regular listener, if you've heard our short story coverage or our TV show coverage, we've got familiar structure, synopsis, reactions, craft, characters, lore, funny stuff. But we'll also do a little bit of book to show. We'll keep that in a kind of single section as much as possible. We don't have a whole lot to say about the show, but we'll throw in some talk here and there because there's some interesting crossover.
But it's pretty good accuracy here from book to show stuff. So we don't have a ton to cover. There are some differences. Maura Lee, one of our favorite women of the podcast surprise group, Kaer Morhen. We care about our Maura Lee. Thank you so much. He said, just wanted to show some love and support. Really, really appreciate that. We'll toss a coin into the podcast surprise fund. And like Aziz said, we're going to have, like the similar kind of structure. We'll be going into craft and lore. We'll be talking about characters, locations, but it's going to flow just a tad bit different since short stories are kind of a little bit more contained. But it'll be the same fun, loving podcast surprise. Aziz, shall we get into the synopsis?
Absolutely. Let's do it. Under the great tree Blaeoberis, the oldest oak on the continent, Dandelion has just given a moving performance. There are people of all races and social classes present, and it appears to have been pleasing to them all. Many eyes are wet from tears, but only a few moments pass before the reverie breaks and the arguments begin. The debates are centered on Dandelion's lyrics, which mention the fates of Geralt, Yennefer, and Ciri. They quibble over love, destiny, whether or not those people are even alive, how they were killed, or whether they even existed in the first place. They yell about race, the battles of Sodden and Marnadal, what Nilfgaard will do next, why they came, and why they might come again. They agree on very little other than the quality of Dandelion's performance, which makes him an unofficial arbiter of sorts. But when they turn to ask him for clarification, code for settle our arguments for us, they realize he's gone. He's moved on to an establishment called Mama Lantieri's, where he's unloading some of the coin he just earned with great efficiency. Then a man he doesn't know approaches him, and at first he expects it's an agent from Dijkstra, but it is not. It is Rance, a Nilfgaardian sorcerer and psychopath, and man whose name can be pronounced many ways without being sure if you're right. Rance was at the performance, and unlike the arguing masses, he saw Dandelion leave and followed him. Out of sight of others, he employs the classic offer of gold or steel. Take this bribe or get tortured. One way or another, he's going to get what he wants. And what he wants to know is, where is Cirilla? Luckily for Dandelion, Yennefer was also watching Dandelion's performance and also followed when he snuck off. Unlike Rian, she really does have a message from Dijkstra, and he wants an update, a report, not in a poetic verse, but in prose. And Yennefer has a message of her own: stop talking about Ciri. Dandelion needs little convincing, given that she has just saved him from torture and death from someone asking about where Ciri is. Rience has even threatened to cut his hands or burn his hands off, which would deprive us all of his lovely playing talents, and we can't have that. The story is just getting started, and Dandelion has many more songs to sing of the events to come. Rience escapes thanks to his mysterious master, but not before Yennefer gives him a wound that she says will require effective burn elixirs and leave him marked for some time. They agree that Geralt must be warned of this threat. They both know he's at Kaer Morhen, but Dandelion doesn't know where that is. Yennefer does, but she doesn't want to go uninvited. We leave them in that state of uncertainty about how to proceed as the narrative shifts to Kaer Morhen. But before that, on the way to Kaer Morhen, Ciri is filled with fear. And it's no wonder Cintra is burning all around her, and she sees and hears people dying as the carnage unfolds. It is vivid and terrible. A loyal knight dutifully tries to carry her to safety through the chaos, but the Black Knight with the bird of prey feathers is in pursuit. Her would-be savior is killed, and then he has her. But then she awakens, uncertain of what he did to her. It was a dream, Geralt reminds her. And though he's right, it was a dream. It seems to be a dream of what really happened. Or, with respect to the uncertainty of dreams, something close to what really happened. The night Cintra fell. She lost her family and home that night, that's for sure, and nothing can ever replace it. But a new home, a new family, that can be found. Found family. Geralt has brought her to meet his. That's what the other Witchers of the School of the Wolf are to him, especially his father figure Vesemir, who asks,
"Who is this child, Wolf? Who is this girl?"
She's my... Geralt suddenly stammered. She felt his strong, hard hands on her shoulders, and suddenly the fear disappeared, vanished without a trace. The roaring red fire gave out warmth, only warmth. The black silhouettes were the silhouettes of friends, carers. Their glistening eyes expressed curiosity, concern, and unease. Geralt's hands clenched over her shoulders. She's our destiny.
And ours too, fellow readers. We're destined to read a lot more about Ciri, and it's going to be amazing and a lot of fun.
So yeah, we've hopefully everybody enjoyed this chapter as much as us. It's a really interesting chapter. Michal has quite a nice section about meta. We're going to talk about that. There's quite a bit of meta in this, and let's go into some personal reactions here. For me, what I really loved about this was that there was kind of a little bit of everything. You know, we get the great conversation around the tree, and everybody's talking about their different perceptions of beauty and religion and love, and there's also some disagreements. We find some racism there, of course, which we've talked about previously. Obviously, the distinction between races and war and all of these different things are going on. And then we have a little bit of Geralt and Ciri. We get a little of their relationship blossoming, and we also get some pretty scary stuff with Rience and Yennefer and all of that. So it didn't feel like a super long chapter to me, even though it is a longer chapter, because I felt like each one was kind of contained. There wasn't like a ton of stuff going on, but I really, really enjoyed the kind of playfulness, especially under Bleo Barris and everybody kind of talking about how they needed to give their respect to Dandelion for how good of a ballad teller he is, even though he was getting himself in trouble for that very reason.
Well said.
So yeah, Miguel, what were your thoughts on this chapter?
I really liked it. I think this is definitely when you're reading it, not for the first time, you recognize how clever it is and how much is really in here. It can feel, I think, a little random because we go from like, Ciri flashbacks to, this random and kind of long conversation under a tree that is, as I'll get into, like extremely meta. And then like we've got some action with Dandelion, but like not really an action character for some reason. And a pair that we haven't really seen, interact very much with Yennefer. And then we go back to Ciri. So it can feel a little bit piecemeal, but I think, and we'll go through it, it's a really interesting way to start the novels as a whole, and like a very smart and kind of Sapkowski kind of way. And when I say very Sapkowski, it means he does whatever the hell he wants. And does not pay attention to any rules that people might
Aziz
feel
is like Aziz is like, each of, we get separate locations, we get kind of separate situations, but all of these situations are connected because people are talking about similar things. Like, obviously Geralt and Ciri are trying to get to Kaer Morhen, and then we get Dandelion singing about the bell, and then Rience is looking for information. So they're all really connected, all of these different scenes.
Yeah, they really are. They flow kind of nicely into each other, even though I agree with Michal that it is kind of random. It's bold to start this book the way he did. I mean, the intro, the dream intro is I wouldn't say that's not a stretch. That's kind of normalish as far as these things go. Having something horrible happen, a city burning is, that's not a bold choice itself. But the Bleobaris scene very much is. It's very quirky and unusual, but it's also serious. It's silly at the same time. Something we've said multiple times is a hallmark of The Witcher. But for me, it's interesting. Ryan in chat says, I couldn't imagine reading this chapter without reading the first 2 short story books. That was my experience. I think I maybe have mentioned it before. It's definitely the time to mention it again. If so, either way. I started with this book because I got mixed up on where it actually started. So I thought this was the first thing. So I read this. I read the first 2 chapters. And before I was like, oh, wait, I'm supposed to have read these short story books first. So I went back and did that. But I was already really into it because of the quirky, but intelligent and well-written first 2 chapters. I thought that narrative style was really neat and fun. And coming from so much work on A Song of Ice and Fire, having a narrator that just having a narrator be a big part of it is different from Song of Ice and Fire at all, let alone a narrator with strong opinions and a sense of humor, right? It isn't just telling you what's happening. They're weighing in on adding additional context. Like, it's a really, it is a really unusual and fun narrative style. And it sucked me in right away.
Yeah, it's definitely got a little bit of everything, but I do agree in the sense that, like, if you didn't read the first 2 short stories, you're missing out a little bit on, how Geralt and Ciri met, and Dandelion's relationship with Geralt, and why they're separated, and why Yennefer and Geralt aren't together. So I think, if you are tuning in for the first time, my guess is that most of you are not, check out the first 2 books before you read Blood of Elves.
That's really interesting because it's sort of, it lays out the purpose of the Bleobaris section. It's kind of like a recap of who these people are and what their relationships are and why we should care about them. And like, that is such a strange, and I think bold is a really good way to put it, Aziz, path to take to that, because it's not usually, you won't usually have a book that are, like all the Harry Potter books have that like one boring chapter at the beginning where it's like, and this is what happened in the last 5 books. And it's like, okay, we get it, we know. But like, this is just like, what if the characters just talked about it? Like, we had a bunch of random people discussing it like it was books that you should have read yourself. And like, you see what they know and what the perceptions are. It's really fascinating. I also like that it grounds us. Sorry, just to start in Ciri's point of view, because I think when it starts in Ciri's point of view, that's a message to us. I think that this is, it is Ciri's story. Like, Geralt is obviously super important, major character, like 1B, but it is ultimately the arc of Cirilla of Cintra and how she becomes who she becomes.
Yeah, that's the one he's not supposed to talk about. That's who everyone's after. That's the one. Yeah, you're right. It does frame that pretty well. Like, Geralt is only, oh, I can't believe they killed him. That's really the most of the extent of, obviously Rience wants to know where he is too, but only in so much as he knows he's with Ciri. So if it wasn't for Ciri, he wouldn't care about where Geralt was at all. So.
It's really funny though. You hear the bickering of, oh, Geralt can't be killed. He's the fastest Witcher I've ever seen. They're just like talking about his different skills and whatnot. But it's so interesting because, when they're having these conversations as the reader, you're like, oh, I know what happened. But like, everybody's kind of giving like, like the game of telephone when someone tells a story and then the story changes by the seventh person, it's all different information. It's kind of funny. You're getting all this different information because people were like, oh, no, she died at Sintra. Oh, no, Geralt died at Trans River, like all of these different things. So it's really funny to kind of hear that. And, obviously there are some funny moments, but they're all connected to this story, and they're really entranced by the ballad. They recognize Dandelion's greatness, I should say.
Yeah, it's really fun to. I mean, it's rather to add on to what Michal said. The have to start with dialogue, just a discussion, is definitely a big part of the boldness of it all. But it works if you're. And the reason I'd say it's bold to also add on to that in a different way is the reason it works is because he writes it really well. I mean, that's why you can get away with it if you write well. It's like, I don't want to say it's bad technique because I'm not a writer. I can't say it is. And I don't mean to even imply that. I'm just saying that, like, that's an example of something that in the real world, when you have a lot of talent, you can get by with bad technique. So it's an example of, I don't know, like, again, I'm not saying this is bad technique, but some writers probably
Unusual
would
technique.
say that it is. What's
Yeah.
that?
Unusual, I think.
Unusual, yeah. So and that's what makes it bold. So from my perspective as a reader, I immediately loved it. So I'm like, well, that bold choice absolutely scored when it comes to me, when it comes to both of y'all, when it comes to probably anyone listening. But it's also fun to acknowledge that, and maybe if y'all could, when you're thinking about this, if this isn't your first read through, which I think a lot of y'all probably have already read it a while ago, or reading it, or are reading it again. If you can think back to how your initial reaction was, that would be a fun thing to do in this moment while we're talking about it.
The world feels really developed. Like, he drops us in and people were having conversations. It feels really deep. It's like, oh, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, we're going to discover so much. Like, obviously we don't know much about Rience at this point. We just know he's a mysterious figure that's looking for Ciri, and he doesn't mean well, obviously, by the way he speaks and the people that he surrounds himself with and whatnot. But it's just so really interesting. Even though there are those funny meta jokes, he is still kind of really putting us in the world, because people, it is this fantastical story where we're hearing about all of these kind of epic adventures that people have had on the continent.
Yeah, everything's really well presented. It's almost like a fire hose. There's all the major characters are mentioned: Nilfgaard and Rience and the Emperor and Vilgefortz and the sorcerers and dwarves and elves and druids.
Dijkstra.
And a lot of those people are there. Yeah, Dijkstra. Yeah, you're right. He's mentioned too. And Philippa's mentioned, and a whole bunch of kings, like 6 or 7 kings get mentioned here and there by either Sheldon Skaggs or
all the Redanian kings.
Yeah, there's just even, and historical kings too. So it's just there's a ton of information in there. It's almost like exposition, but it's not. It's framed it really cleverly. So it's kind of like he figured out a way to give us a lot of information that you don't have to remember it all, but it gives it a lot of, in fact, you don't have to remember any of it. Like, you can forget every single name he mentioned, but if you're coming back on reread, you're like, oh, hey, that's Rayla right there. That's Black Rayla. Cool. And you get to remember these fun characters, and these dots get connected, and you're like, oh yeah, Sheldon Skaggs, we're going to see him again too. That's cool. I didn't realize that he was 500 years old though. He says he was there when the first human ships arrived. Like, he says he remembers that. Like, wait, now you don't know what that means the first time you read it. But
I don't know. He's also the same guy who was like, is anyone here who didn't fight at Sodden?
Yeah,
so I'm like, maybe
right.
he stretches the truth a little bit.
Well, he said there was 100,000
right.
soldiers, right? I mean, we don't know the exact number of soldiers, but that's a lot. And 30,000 people died. Like, we know a lot of people died, but that is huge numbers, right?
Is it ironic if dwarves tell tall tales? Hey-o.
I think part of what this accomplishes also is, like, it's a very contradictory sense of order and chaos, because, like, obviously this is an extremely striated world, and, like, the point of the tree is that everybody comes together despite their differences and their ranks and whatever. And Sapkowski is very clear that it's not as, like, unifying as it seems. But it, I think, I mean, I'm not by any means an expert in, like, medieval life or whatever, but that idea of, like, things being extremely changeable, and there being many, you have so many different levels of nobility and kings and whatever, and so many different factions and people who are trying to get their own way. Not that life is that different now, but I feel like it really fosters that sense of things in that world being like supposed to be very ordered, but also extremely difficult to navigate and chaotic and just
yeah. Well, you hear them say they all have like a certain amount of respect for this Leo Barrison being there, and like they talk about Mother Nature and like, the importance of respecting Mother Nature, but then we obviously see differences. There's some bickering, there's some racism. Like, hey, like that's not cool that you said that. There's obviously we start to see that expand, and that's part of what really like after I read the first two books for the first time, and I read this book, it really pulled me in because I was like, whoa, like there's some big stuff going on the continent, right? Like if this is happening under a little tree, what can we imagine is happening in bigger cities and stuff like that? And obviously, they kind of give us a little, we heard about Nilfgaard, but we get the real picture that Nilfgaard is steam rolling places. Like that's like kind of giving us some context into, okay, Nilfgaard is the big dog and is going to be one of the big dogs in the fight going forward.
Yep, I would agree. It's a great intro. I think it stands out really well. It's just from other intros, from other series that I've read, it really does things differently in so many ways that I'm just very fond of it. A lot of it feels very modern, don't you think? Like the way these arguments play out. Like there's the overly peaceful guy, the elf, argues that no matter what, peace is best, and the dwarf who's like, "Are you kidding? Like people fight so that you can have peace. You gotta have that. You gotta fight for peace in the first place." And the druid who's like, "We have to return to nature," and the priest who's like, "We have to pray harder," and then Nilfgaard was sent to punish us, and these are all relatable. Right? We see all, and things like racism, and like these are all relatable to the real world anyway.
Yeah, when he said the thoughts and prayer stuff, I was like, yeah, I'm not really down for that. Aziz, we have another donation.
Oh, very nice.
Amanda Molyneux, I believe she's in our podcast of fire. Not podcast of fire. Podcast of surprise.
Podcast of fire. Well, it's
podcast of fire. I'm thinking of Ciri's fever dream where she's seeing all this stuff go down.
Yeah. Baptism of fire.
Baptism of fire. And thank you so much, Amanda. We really, really appreciate you. She had mentioned that she had some Merlot and snacks for our podcast tonight, so we hope you're enjoying yourself. We appreciate you.
Very, very nice. Approved.
I just got some sparkling water.
I'm drinking coffee.
Plain old Poland Spring, baby.
Would you like to read this quote, Michal?
Ooh, yes. This is a great one. It's the children one, just to make sure I'm on the right page. Yeah. Okay, cool. Children of elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, half-elves, quarter-elves, and toddlers of mysterious provenance neither knew nor recognized the racial or social divisions, at least not yet.
Yeah, pretty clear weighing in on how that's learned behavior, most of it. And that's pretty poignant. And it's a good example of what I mean when I say it's a bold way to start a book, but it works if you do it well. And that's just a really well-written chapter. Even if you don't agree, which I'm not sure why you would, but whatever. It's still just a very poignant 2 sentences with the add-on of at least not yet says so much. And this is a fantasy world, so the differences are actually somewhat they're not really notable, unlike the real world, right, where the differences are just superficial. And this is where actual different races, and it's still people are still able to live together and work together and get along. So yeah, it's just usually you don't see someone start off with that.
Yeah, well, it's also really interesting. I'm getting a little into some of my long meta rant, but it's good because we should break that up somehow.
Yeah.
But there's a line where Dandelion says that he can't talk about the real people behind his work, or the real message is kind of self-contained. He's not lecturing. He's not telling you specifically like this is about Geralt and whatever. Like if it was about this particular miller's wife, it would just be slander. It wouldn't be a poem. And I find that really ironic, given that Sapkowski really immediately digs his hands right into like not even really metaphor, like basically just message through the world that he's set up, and like he's extremely unshy about that. And I find that like really interesting that he kind of plays with that, I guess, demand that's sometimes made of artists, that their message has to be subtle and under the surface. And he is, right off the bat giving us what he thinks, and will continue to give us what he thinks.
I wonder, like from a meta perspective, I don't mean this to take credit away from him, certainly not, but the fact that I don't think he was trying to do this for a living at first. He just realized it was working. He started off writing a short story and was like, hey, I'm good at this, but he didn't set out to be a writer for a career as a career right away. It just it evolved as like, whoa, I can do this for a career. He didn't in his 20s set out to be an author. Obviously it came much later in life. So you wonder if that's part of that. Like he was able to say what he wanted because he's like, I'm not beholden to like, I don't care. I can say what I want here. I'm not like trying to pander to anyone. If people don't like it, that's fine. I'm not worried about whether they give me their dollars or not. So it's nice to have, and that just goes to show that when you don't have to, when your next meal isn't on the line, your message can be, even that is a privilege of sorts, being able to say what you want in your stories. And he's really good at it. So I'm so glad we're doing this.
You're just reminding me of when Rains is like, I would like to support the arts and the artist. Like maybe do, but not like that.
But I'll also just cut your hands off if you want. That's the alternative.
It is so interesting, right? Because there's some double speak there. We have the whole, Dandelion is doing his ballads, and he's writing about his great fan Geralt, and he's also a spy. So it's like,
that was kind of surprising, and we didn't know that from the short stories, did we? Or did we? I've lost track of when we first learned that. I think that was,
I didn't even pick up on it the first like 2 times I read it, and then when finally Yennefer was like, greetings from Dijkstra, I was like, Dijkstra's a spy. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. What I missed until this time, and the other interesting thing about this time is that it's the first time I've read the books after having seen the show, which the show is different than the books in a lot of ways, obviously, but the scenes that it does do similarly, it causes you to look at them a little differently. Maybe you're imagining them differently because you have a visual image for some of them that causes me to sometimes think about them differently. And also the show had this similar angle of Dijkstra being behind what Dandelion was doing. And so what I had missed until this time was that Dandelion at first thought Rience, when he approached him, was an agent of Dijkstra. And he's like, I was expecting you to introduce yourself as a mutual friend, but when you didn't do that, now I'm, who the hell are you? So I was like, oh, then Yennefer shows up and he does have a message from Dijkstra, which is surprising to him because he was expecting someone he didn't already know.
Even though Sapkowski writes Dandelion is kind of aloof, he's this really intelligent person. Obviously, he knows a lot about the world. Obviously, he's writing these epic ballads and about the continent and different characters and whatnot. But it's like, once he realized that Rance was asking too many questions, he's like, okay, this guy, he wouldn't have to ask this many questions if I was working with him. And he's like, okay, what? I'm not going to answer any more of your questions. I realize I'm in big fucking trouble here.
Yeah. He knew where that was going. He was like, okay, this guy just wants to find Ciri, and doesn't want that information for good reasons.
And he keeps on looking to she's holding I can't remember, the statuette of like water overflowing or something. He's like keeps on looking at that when he's got the secret door in the corner and keeps on looking over there. He's like, oh man, I gotta get out of here. And then there's like a little secret hatch he has to go to. You're like, why does he keep looking over there? Is it like because it's a woman, like the figure of a woman? Because obviously Dandelion's a bit of an adulterer. But that scene is kind of funny. You're like, oh, okay, there was actually a secret passage there.
That was funny.
Ryan Burns mentioned in the chat earlier. There was also, we have a new friend in the chat who I think might.
Oh my God! What?
Welcome, but not that kind of surprise. Ryan mentioned that he enjoys that Dandelion is actually a very talented bard, and I agree. I think there's a lot of fun and silliness that goes along with his talents, but it is really interesting to see and kind of start the series on a note that like he's not just talented, he's influential, and he actually is quite famous. And the point of storytelling that he does is like going to impact the story in turn eventually.
And he is, as I tried to put in the synopsis, or in part in the synopsis, he is a unifying figure. He's the one thing that like gets them all to like stop and pay attention and be like enraptured together. And then as soon as it's over, they're all telling how much they liked it, but while the arguments and bickering are progressing and returning, they're still praising him, but the arguments are happening, and it's praise, argument, as it slowly goes back to normal, and then they realize he's gone. But
it's the Game of Thrones.
Yeah, so that's another kind of meta thing that we're all like, yeah, the story is really like we're all. Yeah.
It's so interesting how that's presented too, Aziz, right? Because we got like all sorts of different people from different walks of life. We have like poor people, and then we have people who consider themselves to be more royal, who are telling Dandelion to, be more confident, like to up his, like, because Dandelion already thinks of himself as someone of status, right? Like he's like this very flamboyant character. But like we have people coming up to him and being like, yes, like, man, you are the ballad guy, you know what I mean? So it's like, Dandelion doesn't necessarily need his ego stroked too much, but they're doing it anyway.
He likes it. Yeah, he's a rock star. He's a rock star.
Balanced nicely, I think, with the suggestion later that he has occasionally stolen lyrics and tunes from other.
There's certain tricks of the trade that would work in that era that wouldn't work in ours, that we got to keep in mind.
It's also funny because they talk of him like as like this like super like this respectable person, you know what I mean? That he just like runs and takes off their money, and they're like, oh, he just left.
Yeah. So good. Should we talk about how should we move on to the next section?
Yeah,
just one thing I wanted to mention that I noticed. I'm not sure about this, but I think I might have found where Yennefer's hiding among the people of the tree.
Really?
Because it says when she says she was there and he didn't see her, she didn't want to be seen. So after the wizards, it talks about a tight-knit, dark, and silent group of peasants lurked in the background, resembling a forest with their rakes, pitchforks, and flails poking above their heads. They were ignored by all and sundry. So,
she was
no proof that she's there, but that might have been where she was hiding.
She would know that that's the people that get the most ignored and most overlooked. So that's exactly making it the best place to hide. What is she again? Like 100 years old? Yeah, she's gonna know things like that. It's not her first rodeo.
And she's gonna know where Dandelion is.
Dandelion, yeah, I know. Isn't that anyone who's listening to the audiobook? That is, you know what Kyle's saying there. It is Dandelion.
Amanda pointed that out, and then chat, and I had to point that out because I listened. I think I listened to the audiobook 3 times before we redid this episode. So nice. Peter Kenny is absolutely fantastic.
He really is. Yes, I'm a big fan.
Yes.
So the chapter is divided into 3 parts, really, one of which is cut in half. So we start and end with Ciri and Geralt, and in between we have the 2 other scenes, each which flows into the next nicely. So we have the conversation around the tree that flows into the inn and the rescue, and they talk about Ciri and Geralt, which then flows into actual Ciri and Geralt arriving at Kaer Morhen and beating Eskel and Vesemir and setting up the next chapter. So it's pretty cool structure, pretty fun to look at that way if you didn't notice it when you're reading it, which is understandable because, I don't know, most people don't just think about how all the chapters are laid out as they're reading them the first time or whatever. So it's usually not something people notice. So I like to see that
a little space to kind of show you where the next part is. And usually you might have like a name at the top of the page or something.
Yeah. So the other kind of established structure that starts happening here is these little lore bits that happen. They're technically at the end of each chapter, but they're really about the next chapter in terms of what the content refers to, except for this first chapter, which has the Ithlinne's prophecy right at the beginning. If you've already read the series, you're familiar with it by now. If not, of course, it gets talked about already in the first chapter, the ravings of a crazy elf, Ithlinne, is what Sheldon Skaggs calls it. But obviously, it's very important to the story. It's going to come back up, and we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about it in different contexts throughout this entire series.
Oh yeah, that one's not going to leave us alone.
Especially since Ciri's having a crazy dream to start off the first chapter. Right?
Oh yeah, that not the first dream she'll have either. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's something cool about that. The opening quote. It's the influence it has within the story, right, Michal?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I mean, this is not unique to Sapkowski, but using in-world texts, which he is pretty much kind of like a master at creating, is a really great technique that I'm kind of a nerd for. And the thing I love about this is that it's immediately and consistently relevant. Like, all the characters are aware of it. It's something that affects the fate of the actions that people take because of Ithlinne's prophecy are continue to affect what people do in the story, and that affects Ciri and Geralt and Yennefer and Dandelion and everybody we come to meet. It's good. I like it.
We definitely see the more religious factions believe in it a little bit more, obviously, but I think that there's a sort of realization that big things are happening on the continent, obviously, with Nilfgaard encroaching, and someone calling himself the White Flame is kind of weird if you think about it. I don't know, if I saw someone calling himself the White Flame, I might think they're kind of crazy.
Gaudy for a title, oof, man, that's pretty. Who gave you that one? You call yourself that? I mean, man, what a power move.
Does sound kind of apocalyptic when Nilfgaard is literally burning towns and cities and steamrolling places. So
yeah, I like how that's made pretty clear right away too. Like the veteran Sheldon Skaggs, who's seen it all, is like, they're going to come back and they're more prepared than we are, even though we beat them. That the way they have their business together is very threatening, and it's again presented in a very relatable way. He's like, look, they're united in purpose. He doesn't describe what type of weapons they have, how good their leaders are. We don't need to know that. I mean, we do know that, and we do know all those things are high quality. But if you happen to be a first-time reader, or if you're not super familiar with it all, you can say, okay, this guy who knows what he's talking about is pointing to a concept that's relatable, which is they're unified in their purpose and united under an authoritarian, which is something that happens in the real world. We all know how dangerous that is. So again, fantasy world, but very relatable. And that's part of what makes when we say it's well written, that's an example of that right there, I think.
He may be jumping up the numbers. Obviously, there may not be 30,000 people who died at the Battle of Sodden, but he talks about the 12 mages who died, and that's a pretty big deal. 12 mages dying in a battle, that's a pretty big deal. And we obviously know how powerful Yennefer is, and there's still, they say, the name of Yennefer isn't on there yet, but that's still a pretty big deal,
Yeah.
30,000.
Wait, no, it's 13 mages. Yeah,
13 mages. Yeah,
right. What's neat is that they have. That gets mentioned as well, and we have representatives of that, and those characters' names pop up a few times because they are enshrined as legends, because they're heroic figures, and that reverberates through the next few years throughout the continent, and the books take place the next few years on the continent. So that's a place where this happens.
We got a excellent comment here from Guy. In the books, people say Nilfgaard is a kind of parallel for the Roman Empire in terms of their military and political structure. The show, maybe not so much. What do you guys think? Well, Guy, I'm not sure if you heard our Nilfgaard episode. This is actually up on the podcast Surprise on Anchor. You can look in the description of the video if you guys haven't checked it out yet. But we kind of talk about that, kind of the comparison of. We talk a little bit about the Roman Empire in that one too, and Aziz definitely goes off and really, really lets us know where kind of some of the influences from the Nilfgaardian Empire have.
Pointing at Aziz, I was like, ask him. The Roman Empire.
Yeah, I agree with the point that it's not so much true with the show. The show, they're more like fanatics. It's a little more the zealotry angles brought out more. So it's maybe more. They're more like, I don't know. It's not as relatable to something in the real world that I could point to. Maybe there probably are some decent examples. It's not certainly not Rome though. Yeah.
Does it feel like a little bit of like the Zoroastrianism that we hear with the Red Priest of R'hllor? I don't want to use a ton of Song of Ice and Fire references, but the fanaticism aspect of it, their belief in the white flame, this kind of, he's made himself into this godlike chosen type emperor, this person who is going to fulfill this prophecy,
Well, not really, because I mean, in some ways, I guess yes and no. Actually, let me revise that. Yes and no, because Zoroastrianism isn't really associated with fanaticism. That part is the R'hllor aspect of that from Game of Thrones is just trumped up to make it more fantasy and fun.
Yeah,
but their Zoroastrianism does have this duality of there's a good and an evil, and the humanity needs to help the good triumph over evil, but they believe that is inevitable, that good will win over evil eventually. Which that's not exactly what the white flame prophecy more is, that evil's going to win. It's like, this world will be enveloped in frost, and that's what's going to happen. So it does have that duality to it, but it's kind of it's its own thing.
It's intense.
Like a mishmash of different real and fantasy religions, I guess. The show version, anyway. But it's also just not that fully explained in the show. In the books, we get a little more. There's a little more nuance and backdrop to it.
Yeah, I think in the books you also can't ignore the connections to Imperial Russia and Communist Russia that I think Sapkowski is alluding to. Like, I don't mean to be strictly biased by the fact that he is, man who grew up right after World War II in Poland. But I don't think you can ignore that. And I think that, the idea of, a tyrannical force coming in and swallowing up all the other countries around it, I think, definitely points to that at times. And that'll be something that's interesting to look to through the series.
It's really interesting because we are actually seeing that now with imperialist Russia trying to swallow Ukraine and other countries in Europe. So that's why the series
is quite love it when fantasy is relevant to the current time.
And then not when bad things happen to other people, but
we don't get the dragons, we just get the imperialism.
Yeah, that's not as fun.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you have what Nilfgaard has, which is you have manpower, cheap manpower that the tyrants, the authoritarians at the top, are willing to throw away. That's one thing that these all have in common. That does make it not parallel to Rome. In Rome, they didn't just throw their soldiers away. They were that was a very resource they protected. But say another comparison we make in our Nilfgaard episode is Star Wars, where the Empire was very willing to throw stormtroopers away. They're just like, keep throwing more and more of these guys at the problem until it goes away. They weren't really concerned with saving lives so much as they were getting their objective. It's like a recurring theme in Star Wars that for example, TIE fighters don't have force fields, and X-Wings do, because the rebellion actually cares about protecting their pilots, and the Empire is expending resources to win rather than
the goal is what matters, not the people.
Yeah, so that's like, and that immediately is an overwhelming factor to show you who's the good guys, who the bad guys are. Like, there's a lot of gray in the Witcher series, but the Nilfgaard as it currently is not particularly gray, and that's part of why they like dress in all black and have all these obvious comparisons to Nazis and Imperial Russia and the Empire of Star Wars, which is also in turn connected, modeled off of the Nazis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we talk about Nazis, we won't get too much into it. But when we look at that type of fascism, there's always some type of religious dogma, and it's always based off that. And we're seeing some of that now, unfortunately, in our day and age. But
that allows them to expend lives, right? That's one
Yeah.
of the justifications they use for death, and like it's all in the it's like it's some sort of greater good, like a twisted greater good argument.
Yeah. Amir definitely believes what he's doing is right. We'll just say that.
Yeah, he thinks he's saving the world on some level, pretty sincerely, which is part of makes it kind of interesting.
but we all agree here in the podcast. Surprise, he's a shit dad.
He's dad, just dad.
Yeah.
With Father's Day recently, Geralt's our daddy. So anyways.
Yeah. That's a good.
I think
I know.
Yeah.
That actually segues well into Ciri's kind of dream flashback and whatever that opens up the chapter, because this is a thread we'll continue to follow through the story, but her interactions with the Black Knight are fundamental to a lot of her experiences going forward and her fears and her actions. And there's a line that only stuck out to me that, because I've read the books. I know some stuff about who is who in these scenarios and what they want and what they're doing. But she says to Geralt, "What did he do to me? I don't remember what he did to me." And that's the thing that scares her most, almost of multiple soldiers dying on top of her, being thrown off of horses, hearing people scream. There's a great line, what must one do to a man to make him scream that way? Of all of that, our question is what did he do to me? And that can lead you into some really horrifying and dark potential places. That, again, I think something Sapkowski does so well is he takes these movements of nations and these, very grand ideas, and he makes them extremely personal, while also talking about them in the meta scale. So yeah, I don't know. Just wanted to point out that particular line.
That is a really intriguing moment, and it's an important one to acknowledge on reread, because it's kind of easy to miss the first time through. But we do know, obviously we're not going to spoil stuff. We're going to take it as it comes. We're just going to set things up when we know they're coming without saying what they are. But we do get resolution on this. We do at least see what happens. So that's nice. We know that's coming.
One thing
it'll be a little while before we get there, though.
One thing I do think that is pretty interesting that was mentioned that I think that could apply to season 3 a little bit more for the show is the whole horses looking like specters, and we get the wild hunt. So that could be maybe something that they took a little bit more from her vision for the show. That might be a little bit exciting.
Drink, guys, we got a wild hunt reference.
But that could be something. But that could be something that's a little bit more interesting for you guys to think about, maybe from something that we didn't get in. They didn't expand on as much as the books, but they might expand more on in the show.
Yeah,
because we did see a pretty interesting scene there.
There's the wild hunt, but Riance is the mild hunt.
Or the child hunt.
Yeah, it's the child hunt. It's all the child hunt.
Yeah, it really is. What a character.
What's next? So I think we covered just tree stuff pretty well, or no? Did we? Not all of it, I guess. But what else do we have here?
I kind of just want to go into a little bit the meta a little more, because I really think that this is Sapkowski teaching us how to read his books. We do become absorbed in and enjoy and feel really strongly about the stories that he's going to tell us, much like the group around the tree. But it's really, I think, essential that you keep an eye on the meta narrative, because this is fundamentally, I think, a story about stories and the way they impact us and why we tell them, what they do, how they change, how they last, and how they change us. That is one of the most prominent themes, I think, to me in the story. I think Lady of the Lake, the final book, is impossible to read if you can't kind of vibe with it on a meta level. Obviously, it's a little bit before we get there, but I think this is a good setup for that. Yeah, and I think that, you know, there are parts of these books that are intense and fascinating and amazing and super interesting, and then there are parts that drag a little bit. But I think that looking at it through that meta lens can help with a lot of that. It can really kind of grease the wheels and illuminate the point of a lot of those like so when we get to a certain lodge and certain witches are sitting and talking about genetics for a really long time, that's kind of part of why that's there and what's happening.
Definitely. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Aziz.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I agree with Michal on the fantastical element. Like, he goes through the first two books and we hear about all these kind of fairy tales, and obviously Lady of the Lake, there's definitely a huge aspect of that, you know. And I think Blood of Elves, there's a little bit less of that, but Sapkowski, you know, plants these things in your head, and we hear about it a little bit here in the first chapter. He's planting those ideas again, letting us know that this story has a lot of influence from fairy tales, of course. I mean, look at all of the influence that we got from all of the short stories. So Michal is definitely hitting the nail on the head in the sense that he's just reminding us, like, hey, you know what I mean? Like, this is it, you know?
Yeah, it's really well done. Yeah, that was really well said, Michal. And to maybe add just a little bit, we talk about it a lot in the short stories, how he likes to play with storytelling, how like methods of storytelling and presentation, but he doesn't have the freedom to do it in a short story like he does in an epic, because he has time to shift and stay within one mode before he shifts into another one. Whereas in a short story, it's all 60 pages or whatever. There's only so much time you have to shift and have it even be noticed, or to present things from a different perspective. When there's a smaller cast of characters and you're not shifting locations and things like that. In this epic of 5 books, we get to look at things from different times, and we have these little epigraphs, and we have of just campfire versions and people telling each other stories and the narrator presenting things. I couldn't possibly name all the ways that he tells the story within the story. And I love that he starts with people having just heard a story. And that's where we start. So it's nice and smooth.
There's also, it's worth noting, some hilarious meta about people who engage in art to artists. Like the section where everybody's like, okay, but how did it end? Like, what happens next? Like, George R. R. Martin, what happens next? You know? And it's like, I just feel like a lot of, I honestly don't know how famous or how much fan attention Sapkowski was getting when he wrote this, but it reads to me like an author who was like, I will call you all out, basically by name, if I have to do. It's like,
well, Dandelion is certainly getting a lot of attention, Michal. Right?
Yeah, we have this one line that's very meta here. Michal, you want to read that?
Yeah. Songs and ballads never end, dear lady, because poetry is eternal and immortal. It knows no beginning, no end. And then people are like, cool, but what happens next?
I wonder if he was like covering his own ass when he wrote that. He's like, just in case I have little problems, I'm just going to throw this in here.
Which kind of happens. The end of the Witcher series is kind of amazing, I think, and baffling and curious and strange. But like, this actually kind of ties into that really, really beautifully if you've read all the way through.
It's also hard to imagine, like you say, though, or at least you're alluding to here. He probably didn't plan it like that exactly. He may have had some idea, but I'm skeptical that he was like, and then I'm going to do this, you know?
Oh yeah, no.
I think he just, again, he made some bold choices and relied on his skill to get him through that, and it worked. Yeah.
And then we get another book.
There's also a hilarious. Sorry, Kyle. I just have to say one thing. It's just because it stuck out at me so much. It's like there's one line where Dandelion's like, "Oh no, I meant for you to feel unfulfilled and confused at the end," and it's like this is just such an author thing to say. It's like, yes, you're unhappy. Thank you. I meant.
He's like, you told us right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Like we should have read the fine print. It was there.
And then Sapkowski couldn't help himself and put out Season of Storms.
Yeah.
Which
you
is
wonder
great.
if he'll do any more. You wonder if he'll throw another one out there, and if maybe he'll, who knows? You never know. Yeah.
I mean, Witcher is certainly making the big bucks. He could maybe get a little bit excited. I mean, they are creating the Witcherverse out there, so who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe he'll revisit it.
He didn't. He doesn't need to make more money, but maybe he wants to. I don't know. Or maybe he just has a good idea and wants to write it. Who knows?
But I think he's content with the show, kind of telling another part of the story. I think there will be some differences for sure in the show. I think.
Yeah, it's hard for him not to just be like, even if he doesn't like the show, and I'm not saying he doesn't or does, I don't really know, because he's probably not going to be super honest about his own opinion in interviews. But it would be hard for him to complain too much, given how he presents his version of storytelling and how all these different varieties are valid, and how open he's always been to fan fiction and other people writing in his world, which he's always been very open to that. So it would be kind of weird for him to be like, because he surely knows that when you allow that it's going to have a variety of results.
Yeah. Sapkowski we love. So are we getting into the Rience Dandelion Yennefer stuff now?
Sure, let's talk about that. Yeah, he talks about the Dandelion's clever with noticing the difference in how things are worded. That reminded me of the scene if y'all have seen Inglourious Bastards, where the guy holds up 3 fingers for 3 drinks, and he's undercover. He's a British guy, and he's masquerading as a Nazi. And the Nazis realize that outs him holding up 3 fingers, because he holds them up as 3 middle fingers rather than holding up a thumb. Right? A German-born person would have held up a thumb and the first 2 fingers.
Germans do this, I think.
Yeah. So this is a similar kind of thing where
the Germans do that. Yeah.
So it's a similar kind of concept where just a little subtle difference in language or phrasing, or in that case, a hand gesture, gives the whole game away. And because there's no accent. I mean, if he doesn't have a Nilfgaardian accent, or if he does, if there is such a thing as a Nilfgaardian accent, he did hide that. So this was the leak in his disguise, which is kind of how I think of it. I think that he was trying to hide where he's from, but that was the leak, and Dandelion gets credit for it. And it makes sense, because he's a poet. He would notice the specific phrasing. A guy who's known for lyrics and stuff.
Yeah, their conversation was so interesting, right? Because Dandelion is trying to really... at first he thinks he's working with him, and then he realizes there's something wrong, so he's trying not to give any information. And then the guy he just realized how screwed he is. He's like, there's nothing he can do, right?
Yeah.
Like, what would you guys do in that situation? I've thought about myself. I thought about it myself. I'm like, how could have Dandelion handled it any differently? Really, honestly.
Yeah. He knew, like, the thing about Dandelion is he's afraid of. When he can run, he will, and he's afraid. But we've seen him back into a corner before, and he knows he's just worldly enough to know that there's no way out of this. Like, the guy's going to kill him anyway, whether he talks or not. He's smart enough to know that. So he's like, well, I may as well not make it easy on him. And we've seen him tied up before, by the elves. So this is kind of set up by being captured by Filavandrel and all that, because we know it's like that cornered rat concept, where a rat will run and run and run, but when it has nowhere to run, it will fight back. It'll use what little it has. And again, Dandelion's kind of like that.
You know what I find interesting about this too, and I want you guys to kind of chime in on this, is that obviously Yennefer scolds Dandelion a little bit, like, hey, you got to be more careful about talking about Ciri. You know what I mean? But Dandelion does try really hard. He does realize that if he's trying not to talk about Geralt and Ciri until he realizes, he doesn't have a choice anymore. And I love that aspect of that. You could tell that Dandelion still really cares. You know what I mean? Like, he still really values Geralt as a friend, and
it's one of the few times we see him be humble, right? It's neat to see him humble there. He's like, when he talks about Geralt, it's one of the few times he's not haughty, because he's always like, one of the recurring like phrase associated with him is putting on airs. He always like acts haughty, or uses that as a defense mechanism or as a way to put people down. But
but you can tell he
considers Geralt. Yeah,
you can tell he considers Geralt a true friend, even though they've had their fair share of Taylor Swifty breakups.
I think it's really important to see him like this, because one of my frustrations in a lot of the short stories is that, like, for the most part, he's kind of a womanizing asshole, and like has a little bit more depth, but it doesn't often go like much more than like a fingernail. And I think starting off like this, presenting him as someone who, like, yes, he's a womanizer, yes, he didn't want anybody paying attention to his apprentice over him, and he's like, stop playing or stop singing or whatever. But he's willing to be tortured for his friend, and to, even though he, by his own admission, is not, a very strong person, he holds out for a really long time. And like, I think that is a good, a really good place to start Dandelion's journey, because you're right, like he's in many ways a very frivolous character and a comedic character, but he is also deeply rooted in the heart of the story, and has connections that go like way deeper than like funny sidekick.
The pockets of Rience, the amount of money that he offered, because that was a lot of money. The way it was described, it was like a ching, like dropping it on the table like a sack of potatoes.
Yeah, it was like described as more than what he had just earned.
Yeah,
I think is what it said, something like that. Yeah,
and that's a good parallel to him like just scarpering with the money that he got from the tree, which, I mean, to be fair, was his, but like,
yeah, he wanted to remove himself from that situation, but he wouldn't take dirty money from this guy.
Yeah. So they have this sort of ends with their conundrum on what to do. They both agree that Geralt needs to know, but how are they going to tell? That there's no way Dandelion himself can go. Not only does he not know where it is, even if Yennefer were to tell him, his cover is blown. He's compromised. You can't guarantee that no one will follow him. So that's just out of the question. So better just to keep him from knowing. It worked out better that way, because he was almost tortured. Better that he not know. Better that he can't reveal it. If he's captured and tortured again, it's better that he can't say. He doesn't know where Kaer Morhen is. It would be the truth. If they're going to kill him anyway, he may as well not give up the info,
He did reveal some information, but good thing he didn't know about Kaer Morhen, and Yennefer happened to be there in the nick of time.
Yeah, she was. She had his back.
Yeah, and I mean that also just like poses her as like, I think the way she's described in the way the people at the tree are talking about her is like the beautiful Yennefer with the love affair with Geralt and mysterious witch, whatever, and like she's a straight badass. Right off the bat. And like, and even Sapkowski kind of like tones down a lot of the look how gorgeous Yennefer is, which is like a big part of the way she's described. And it's important to her character, but like a big part of the way she's described in the short stories. I think we get some like tumbling hair and violet eyes, but like not extensive discussions of her figure and all the stuff. It's really about her magical prowess and her cleverness and her, frankly, cold-bloodedness. Like when Dandelion's like, "What? You killed both of them?" And she's like, "Yeah."
Like, whoops! I didn't mean to kill that second one. But
Aziz, there's definitely some differences in how this fight, the burning of Rience's face goes down for sure. Obviously, there's no lightning bolt and there's no spectral second of Yennefer, so it's kind of like I wasn't disappointed with how it went down in the show so much, but I still think it was effective because it was just great to see Yennefer and Dandelion back together. But there's a different situation that's happening in the show, right? Yennefer has a lack of chaos.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
well, a lot of I like the way it ends, right? We get to see them have like a bonding moment and talk about a kind of a core element, another setup moment here early on, that their friendships, their found family is very important and needs to be established, and reminding the reader of that. But there is a lot of characters in this opening scene. We mentioned that earlier, that there's so many names were thrown around, and it's fun to see that. It's nice to be able to keep track of who's who. But there's also a lot of characters that we just don't see again. And it's also good to know that we don't have to think of them.
What, you don't like Baron Villebert?
Yeah, it's well. I love that we have Baron Villibert and daughters, and then Vera Lowenhaupt and sons. So there's both. Like we've got that covered there, and we don't see the Baron Villibert again, but we do sort of see Vera Lowenhaupt and sons again, sort of.
We see someone from Illyria, which is interesting.
Yeah, we see Black Rayla, of course. We'll definitely see more of her. We got the guy Donomir of Troy, the human that argues with Sheldon. We don't see him again, but what's interesting is there's a little bit of lore attached to him, which is his sigil, the 3 lions, which is the same sigil that the first warlord of humanity carried when they landed their ships and on the first landing. And it was also the sigil of Sintra. So they kind of it's been adapted as part of a lot of human kingdoms, the 3 lions. So it's kind of a neat little mini world building detail there for you. The elves aren't any. There's none of those elves are named. Neither are the priest or the druid. So there's just
these names are features, right?
Yeah, that's that way. I think maybe just because there's already so many characters, Sapkowski declined to give names to these characters. So it's like, all right, I'll give you all a little bit of a break here.
I don't know. I'll remember the beautiful elf with the ermine cap or whatever for forever. I mean, she's a standout.
I was wondering if she was someone, but I couldn't match her with anyone. There's nothing. So, I mean, it's not like Francesca or anything. Francesca's got blonde hair, so.
Yeah, the only thing I was thinking of is like the illusion that Yennefer sends into the thing also is wearing a tight cap. So I was like, was she posing as the elf? I don't think so, because Dandelion says he didn't see her, and she says she didn't want to be seen. But I mean, then maybe like he didn't recognize her, so maybe that's the same. I don't know. But
I believe the cap was described as being dark, if I'm not like a dark blue or something. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I'll have to go back and read it again, but I don't think it was Yennefer though. But it may be kind of funny that she was following them around. I mean, like she was there for that whole conversation.
It makes it more believable. It's one of the smart choices Sapkowski made in having Dandelion be a character, is that you have a famous performer, and then that enables it to be somewhat realistic when people find him. Like when Yennefer finds him or Geralt finds him, because they've found each other out in the world many times in the past in the short stories, and because he's a little bit famous or a lot famous, that it's like, oh, there'd be a buzz when a famous person's around, and that can help explain these encounters and how Yennefer was on his trail in the first place. Like, oh, he's on tour.
We recognize Dandelion's fancy jacket, his fancy purple jacket.
Yeah. So there's almost every king is named that's currently in there. Some that we already have heard, like Foltest, and some that won't come up for a while, like Estrad Thyssen, and then Nidamir and Ervil and Demavend and Henselt and the League of Hengfors, and all these names that you'll hear again, but aren't super important to know now, but they're fun to connect the dots and set that up. Some of the mages get mentioned. Of course, we already mentioned Vilgefortz. The one knight he's like, we'll never forget the sorceresses who died. Coral, Triss, and I forget the other one. It's Vaniel of Bruges, by the way. I did look that up.
And Triss is alive, so it's like,
and Triss isn't actually dead. Yes, so it's all just like. So
we also do get Eskel. Cairmorn.
And Vesemir, technically their first appearances, right? We've heard the name Vesemir before, of course, and of course on TV and everything, and Eskel's been on TV, but technically in the books, this is their first actual appearance. But more about them next chapter when there's like a lot of them. So yeah.
Is Bleobaris a character technically? Because it's
it's got a name like a character, and if it's the first, like the biggest or oldest oak, does that mean the other oaks are its descendants? I mean, is there some meta in there that we all descend from? Like, this is the Adam and Eve of oak trees?
Well, we kind of get a little bit of the Ents vibe with the first acorn, kind of Lord of the Rings kind of influence there. So I really
here's the quote, right, Michal? You got this.
Yes. The glade beneath Bloberus, the great oak, was a place of frequent rallies, a well-known travellers' resting place and meeting ground for wanderers, and was famous for its tolerance and openness. The Druids protecting the ancient tree called it the seat of friendship, and willingly welcomed all comers.
So just in case you didn't know, the root of the word druid, root, see what I did there,
Yeah.
is the words oak and knower, like oak knower. So that's why druids are in part associated with oaks. Real world druids associated with oaks. So yeah, no. There you go. Now you're an oak knower as well. I didn't think I didn't think there was any herb lore on this one, although I guess you could count that as a little bit of herb lore for oaks. There's a lot more behind oaks, but I think we've talked about them before anyway, so I don't need to go back to that. We'll just leave it there for now. Leave it there for now. And this is so acorny, isn't it? Yeah.
Chat, Aziz is like this behind the scenes, by the way, too.
I'm like this in real life. It's
his jokes, man, I swear.
So there is Hyacinth, the Mama Lantieri, the proprietor of the inn where Dandelion and Riance have their encounter. She smells of hyacinth. So that limits the symbolism because hyacinths have a bunch of different colors. And the color is what determines the type of symbol they are. There's a bunch of different versions of it. But all of them are spring, which is renewal and new beginnings, which is it's the beginning of the book. It's a new, because that's very fitting. So I think that was probably intentional, as we often somewhat assume these things are. But it could be coincidence. You never know. My only other part I pulled as far as lore was this bit that Sheldon Skaggs was telling us is from his memory, and as y'all are right to question whether it's really from his memories or not, but there's definitely a chance he really did see these things. Either way, it's a stirring moment that I thought we should quote. So please proceed, Michal.
Yeah. Search back through your memories to the past, to the days of Desmond, Radovid, and Sambuk, to the days of Abrad the Old Oak. You may not remember them because your lives are so very short. You're like mayflies. But I remember, and I'll tell you what it was like in these lands just after you climbed from your boats on the Yaruga estuary and the Pontar Delta onto the beach. 3 kingdoms sprang from the 4 ships which beached on those shores, etc., etc.
etc. Yeah, he goes on and on, right? he's got a lot to say, Sheldon Skaggs does. So that was an important little slice of it. Sambuk and Desmod were the first human kings, Sambuk of Redania and Desmod of Temeria. They weren't the same kingdoms that they are now. The particular regions that made up Redania and Temeria were different back then. We don't need to get into that right now. That might be a fun thing to cover separately in some sort of history episode. But Radovid was also an early king. He's also associated with these guys. But Abrad was his ancestor, was not really a king. He called himself a king, but isn't considered to have wielded the power of one, I guess. It's unclear. But he has a cool name, Abrad the Old Oak. So the point being in, the Old Oak, right? That's relevant to having the same name as this tree. So it kind of goes to show it's like a meta statement on how we all kind of, you go back far enough and we all kind of come from the same sources. We all come from the same family tree or the same, meta oak tree, however you want to phrase it, whatever metaphor suits you. So there's a lot of different ways that's expressed here. But there's a pretty good amount of Witcher history, Witcher verse history here that's being spoken there. And I love how those few lines can take you down a rabbit hole. And we'll have reason to come back to some of these characters because these countries are obviously still around in terms of historical length of time. Like I said, the length of Sheldon Skaggs' purported age is roughly the length of a lot of these kingdoms. So he's roughly, he would be at least 500 years old if he's that old. And a lot of these kingdoms formed about 100 years later or in that century. So 400 years old roughly is how old Temeria and Redania are. And, that's not super old, right? These are still, it's older than like the United States, but in terms of like Europe and Asia and Africa, that's not that old for the length of a country. And so kind of interesting perspective to put on it all.
after the books and during Witcher 3, we get the 5th Radovid. So we get Radovid come again. Like there's, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, this one was the Radovid the Great, so that's part of why the name stuck. They're like, oh, we want to be like him. Yeah.
So yeah, shall we go into book to show now, or do we have some?
We just have a few notes on that, yeah. But as a segue into that, Dandelion asks Yennefer if she can draw information from the 2 thugs, like even though they're dead. Yeah. He's like, can't you still, even though they're dead, can't you still do that? And she's like, that magic is banned, and they probably don't know anything anyway. So, which is true. They were just thugs. They probably didn't know anything. They may have known something that they could use, to track something down. Maybe Brown said something in their presence that he shouldn't have. But anyway, they're not going to go that route because she says it's banned and it's probably not worth it anyway. But that reminds me a little bit of what we saw at the beginning of season 2, and that makes it a good segue. Is Tissaia was like touching corpses and seeing their like last 20 seconds. And it was a really neat visual. And it reminds me of that. It's kind of the same thing. She's like reading their memories. It's like necrocam or the dead cam.
It's almost like what Spock does, right? With like looking into people's memories.
Yeah, except with dead people. So yeah, it was kind of cool. It was yeah, you're right though. That's a good parallel or whatever. So I thought that was neat and a good way to start this off. So yeah, there's overall the book to show is really like pretty straightforward here. There's a lot of, I mean, like you said earlier, Kyle, it's the torture scene and Yennefer's rescue is really similar. He doesn't quite get as far in the torture in the show version, but whatever. That's a really minor difference. And it's like you said, she doesn't have her magic, but instead she uses alcohol and like a torch or whatever, or his own flame. And it's a similar result. He gets a burned fire. His master helps him escape through a portal. Yeah. And they have a heart-to-heart afterwards, and there's Dijkstra behind it all, and helping out and whatever. Yeah, the same elements are there. It's in an inn. I mean, yeah, it's all really similar. Ditto the fall of Sintra, right? Like that's pretty similar. The show gives more detail because it kind of has to, but it's not like doesn't make any bold statements about what could have happened instead. It all seems to fit the books in my opinion.
For those of you who have checked out our show episodes, you will remember that we were all really enjoyed season 2, and we felt that that it was well done. And I felt like I wasn't disappointed or anything. Like I would. I mean, obviously I want as much as I can from the books, but obviously Yennefer doesn't have her magic, so I'm not going to be like upset that she's not shooting lightning bolts out of her hand like Palpatine or some shit.
Amazing how Star Wars has come up more than Game of Thrones this time. It's amazing. See, we do have variety. So the Kaer Morhen thing is kind of similar too from the show. Like she has some bad dreams. Obviously they don't have the grain of truth thing doesn't happen on the way to Kaer Morhen like it did in the show, but I thought that was a pretty clever way to fit that in. So,
we also get some rats, Michal.
Yeah, the rats again, right? That's a little rat foreshadowing, right?
So many references to rats.
Don't loiter in the dark or the rats will eat your boots, Eskel says. Like, yep.
It's fine. It's fine. They're just rats. Not standing in for anything later.
I think it's twice they're referenced in that one little blurb where it's very short, right? It's mostly about Vesemir and meeting them all and Eskel walking down the hall, but still he squeaks in the rats. I did it again. I didn't even mean to make that pun. Squeaks in 2 sets of rats.
This was one thing that was kind of mentioned on Reddit too, like some of the foreshadowing from Eskel and stuff in Blood of Elves that wasn't included in the show, and then obviously we had the whole differences with Eskel in the show, which we'll probably talk about later on. But I'll just leave it at that.
Word. Yeah, and of course there's a lot more Witchers in the show version than there are here, but that's also mostly just because they were going to get killed off. It ended kind of a similar state.
We still get
which is kind of funny though, because like usually on you remember like the tournaments on Game of Thrones where it was like there were 10,000 people there were 200 people at this tournament. Like we did not have money for this crowd seat.
The one important thing is we do get the core Witchers though, that are Cohen, Lambert, Eskel, and those ones are and Vesemir, of course. Those are the important ones.
Yep. Yeah, I guess the other irony there is that all shows during the COVID era had to cut back on extra characters. Any crowd scenes were smaller. This isn't a crowd. I mean, these are Witchers. They're not still an army or whatever. But still, there were a lot of shows that had like sparse crowds and sparse backgrounds. Like, why aren't there more? And it's like, oh yeah, that's why there aren't more. Yeah, understandable.
Yeah. So now
the opposite end of COVID.
They're doing well. They're actually filming right now, which is a good thing, and they're doing well. So there's
cool. Yeah.
Apparently no hiccups. So fingers crossed, knock on wood, all that. Let's continue. I hope it continues to go well.
Yeah.
So funny moments. There's quite a few, huh?
Yeah. The Witcher Blood. We start off. I appreciate how well this first chapter establishes or reestablishes a lot of its familiar themes, and having the funny elements is a big part of that. It's an overarching feature of the series that really, in my mind, puts it ahead of a lot of other series. It's series, man. That's just, you can't have. Did he do that on purpose? Have a character named Ciri, so you're always saying series plural, and it's series. Anyway, like, out of all my favorite fantasy and sci-fi series that aren't intentionally like primarily comedic, and I actually can't think of one that is primarily comedic, this is the one that makes me laugh the most, I think.
100%.
And yeah, so I mean, I'll say that since this is our first episode in the epic, I'll say that now, because we'll probably frequently have a lot of examples of our favorite funny moments.
One of the funniest things for me was when they're all having that chat under Bleobarris is when, they're all talking about, they're like, we can, dandelions being attracted to this person, that person, and then we get the description of dwarven women, and it's just kind of like this, like, like a meta description of dwarven women that we have from like, like something like Gimli would say, and I thought that was really funny. So I love the whole Sheldon Skaggs and all the dwarves and all the kind of funky different little characters, and obviously there's some very serious moments, but there's a lot of really funny moments in those conversations, just like the people just going over and fawning over Dandelion. I just thought that was so funny.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons he can make the straightforward, non-subtle political messages kind of work even more by like changing the tone really quickly. Again, it's this thing you have to be skillful to be able to do that as a writer. I assume, not having done it myself, but by just being able to dress it all down and bring down the mood or change it to from whatever mood he sets, whether it's serious or poignant or disturbing, he can quickly bring us back to smiles and chuckles, if not outright laughing, and that's great.
So we have a bunch of quotes here that we're going to go through. Who wants to do this first one?
I fried him a little too hard. See, even his teeth are charred. What's the matter with you, Dandelion? Are you going to be sick?
Even his teeth are charred. Can you picture that? I mean, maybe you shouldn't picture that, but ooh, the way Peter Kenny reads that too, she's so like nonchalant. She's like, I fried him a little too hard.
And it rhymes. I fried him a little too hard. His teeth are charred.
Yeah.
It's very poetic.
Good. Ding, ding, that's why Dandelion was throwing up. That rhyme was too awkward. He's like, that rhyme is just
that rhyme was awful. I didn't like
He doesn't mind the corpse. He's just it's his poetic sense. I love how he's just flummoxed by her eating chicken with a knife and fork, and he's like, "Oh, that's why Geralt eats chicken with a knife and fork."
Yes,
like, that's such a funny thing for him to include.
Geralt
when you have friends who are together, and you're like, "Oh, now they both do that thing."
Yeah, they both do that thing.
I get a huge kick out of Rhys not being able to remember whether Geralt's name is Geralt or Gerald, and that still happens among people talking about The Witcher when they haven't like really dived into it, which is understandable, but it's still hilarious.
Our transcription software that I use to help with the editing also can't get over that name. It doesn't know It's like, no, Gerald, right? And like, nope, not Gerald.
That's what my little cousin says. So I find that really funny, Gerald. I was like, no, man, Gerald.
I even taught the transcription software Kaer Morhen. Like, it knows that, but it still can't get Geralt because it's too similar to another word. Like Kaer Morhen, there's nothing else like that. So it's like, oh, okay.
There's a lot of words in this. There's a lot of words in this chapter that are like, okay, transcription, man. Like, I could just imagine what an AI would make it sound like. Just
we'll start having those in our funny moments section because this is our first episode of Blood of Elves. I'll have some transcription follies probably in future episodes that we'll include in this section. Well, here's another quote. Yeah.
This comes when Sheldon Skaggs is kind of going off on his rants, and one of the elves is like, it's not smart to or polite to insult someone else's religion or mock someone's religion. So he says, I'm not mocking anything, protested the dwarf. I don't doubt the existence of the gods, but it annoys me when someone drags them into earthly matters and tries to pull the wool over my eyes using the prophecies of some crazy elf.
The prophecies of some crazy elf.
Yeah. And then we realize it's not crazy because it's funny that he's saying.
Yeah. And his point is right, though. You agree with his point, even though Ithleen's prophecy, there's some merit to it. But he's like, we all have been there. Like, oh, God's got nothing to do with this, you know? Stop bringing that up. It's got you can't. That's you.
I love this next one.
This is hilarious. This is Yennefer talking to Dandelion about Dijkstra. He asked me to convey that this time your report should be to the point, detailed, and under no circumstances in verse. Prose, Dandelion. Prose.
Like the charred corpse, but a lot more pleasant to imagine. You wonder, what is he like? Is he sending poems? Really?
Yeah.
Is he really updating Dijkstra with poems?
That's the perfect characterization of Dandelion. That he's sending his important spy reports in rhyme.
He thinks he's clever that way. Like,
I was thinking to myself, how would you glorify and fantasize how Rience's teeth are charred, and how would he say it? And I'm like, what? What did he actually say to Dijkstra for Dijkstra? It must have been something like really stupid. You know what I mean? He must have just been overly talkative, very, very, very flamboyant, like usually Dandelion is. You know, just I want to see what letters he sent to Dijkstra.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we need photocopies of those. I love when the performance ends. There's the way it's described. I wish we had a visual of this, but I kind of don't think we'll get it since the show's moved past this point already. Which is that the way it's described is the show ends and they're also moved that no one makes a sound, but then there's a goat that goes meh, and then that. Then everyone starts to oh, wow, that was amazing. But they're all it's the goat. So he's the goat that broke the silence, the important goat. And then the apprentice brings out a hat to collect coins. And then he's like, actually, and he sets it back down and grabs a bucket instead. And Dandelion is like, good job. Smart move, kid.
We have a mind your tongue, Beardy.
Yeah, that's what one of the I think one of the elves I think one of the humans says that to the gnome. I think, mind your tongue, Beardy, or maybe he says it to a dwarf. But Beardy, it's really not. It's really a weak insult.
Yeah,
Beardy. Like, Kyle, if someone called you Beardy or me Beardy,
I'd be like, hey, thanks.
What if we called Michal long hair? Well, that's whoa, damn.
His beard must be as long as him. Maybe that's why it's yeah.
He thinks it's just anyone without a shaved face is.
They're very beardist. Wow, that's rude.
So who noted? One of y'all wrote down that apprentice that collected the money. We just never see him again, do we?
Yeah. I find it hilarious that Dandelion's apprentice is there fairly prominently through the first scene, and then he's gone. That's it. No more apprentice ever.
He's playing along. Yeah, like I took note of that when you pointed that out, because I didn't even think about that. And then when I went back to read it one more time, I saw like he's harmonizing with him. So he's not just like a roadie or something. Like, yeah, that guy is part of the performance. well, I guess Dandelion left him behind.
Oh.
So I think it was a dwarf that had "Mind Your Tongue, Beardy" directed at him, but one of the gnomes is like tries to actually stop the arguing, which is kind of fun to have the gnome be the one that did that, because the gnomes are apparently the oldest race there.
Yeah,
like they've been around the longest, so they're like, maybe in a sense you could say they're the wisest, if you want to think about it that way, if age gives you any wisdom at all. And he's basically like, he doesn't say it this bluntly, but he basically says, stop arguing, let's drink. And he says, but he does say, our throats are dry from all these emotions.
from all the yelling. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty diplomatic. It doesn't work, but it's a good try, and I appreciate it.
Rienne's has quite a few things that, like, a lot of really nasty words.
I took down the list of all the things Rienne's calls Dandelion, because it's really funny. So they're like, boy,
little cock.
These are some heavy insults. Okay, nasty, rhymester, runt, scum, piece of scum, arrogant nobody, clown, sheep's head, and yeah, as Kyle said, little cock. That's
I was just like, how would Rience know? You know, like, he was being the alpha in that situation, so I guess it made sense. Toxic masculinity.
Yeah. Another great line is, Dandelion was mistaken, as was usually the case when he was too confident.
Oh, it's such a great character.
And part of that confidence is expressed in this line where he's like, if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to have Mama Lantieri's bouncer kick you so hard, you'll fly over this town, people will take you for a Pegasus. And of course, that doesn't phase Rience at all. But I think it's kind of funny because if y'all remember, throughout most of the series, Dandelion is going to ride a horse called Pegasus. So,
which is absolutely hilarious. And then we have the naughty graffiti on the tree.
Yeah, people have on the tree.
Defiling the oldest oak, the great tree of the world, like the world tree. Naughty graffiti.
Well, I think that's it for our funny moments. That, as y'all can see, there was a pretty solid dose.
Yeah,
that should be the norm, I would think. Not always, though. There's going to be some chapters that are kind of somber, but we'll find the fun where we can in those cases.
Blood of Elves is fairly lighthearted, I think, for most of it. But
the next couple of books get a little more serious for
sure. Darker. Yeah.
Time of Contempt and Baptism of Fire are a little heavier. You're right.
Yeah, things get pretty dark. No joke.
Yeah. But we'll have fun with them because it's fake darkness. We're not exactly going over real world events, even though we sometimes refer to them on our show.
Michal, shall you move us to our outro?
Yeah, we got a cool quote to finish off with here. This is Yennefer.
I just thought this was apt. She says, "Difficult times are approaching," she said quietly. "Difficult and dangerous. A time of change is coming. It would be a shame to grow old with the uncomfortable conviction that one had done nothing to ensure that these changes are for the better. Don't you agree?" Yes.
I agree. Yeah, I think we all do. That's a great sentiment for the series and for real life. I'm glad you pulled that quote. Good choice there, Michal.
You also picked a great one to start off with as well.
True that. Well, thanks to our supporters, Maura Lee, Ryan B., Rhett Krisman, Cato Vivas, James Gannon, Lucas Mees, LC, Amy Lantrip, Alejandro Martinez, and Neil Anderson. Much appreciated.
To Maura Lee and Amanda for making those donations in the chat this evening. Thank you very much. Well, I would love to buy these two dinner together, but we're seeing each other at different times this year. So at some point we will be able to do that and share.
That's great.
A lot of you guys have for us.
Our plan going forward is to do about one episode a month. Occasionally a little more and occasionally a little less, depending on what else is going on in the world. And we will also switch to TV show mode whenever there's a show on, and then we'll just switch back to book mode when there isn't. So it should be pretty straightforward, and we'll do our best to stay on schedule.
Blood of Elves has 7 chapters, so
Yeah.
it'll be right around Christmas time. Blood Origin is supposed to come out, so when Blood Origin comes out, there's only supposed to be 6 episodes or 4 episodes now. There's been some issues with that, so but whenever it comes out, we're definitely going to cover that, like we did with Nightmare of the Wolf. We really had a fun time covering that.
Yeah.
And what's next for you guys? Start with you, Michal.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. Ink as Rain is my handle. You can find me doing the Level 7 Access podcast. We were talking about Miss Marvel. We are going to do a collected episode on Kenobi because we just could not get our shit together to do episode by episode. But you can probably find my thoughts on Kenobi if you look at my Twitter, because I'm not shy about that.
You might want to budget some extra time for that, folks, if you are going to read her tweets on Kenobi.
And I haven't talked too much about this on here, but the Dragon Prince season 4, the show that I write for, is coming out this year. We have a really cool preview thing that is online, and if you want to check that out, do that, or watch seasons 1 through 3 if you haven't yet.
We're proud fans of Michal, and we definitely are proud of her being a writer for Dragon Prince.
That is very cool. I know it's like very under the radar thing here. I think you deserve more notice for that. I think a lot of our listeners aren't aware that you write for a pretty well-known TV show, and one that has a lot of acclaim.
You can find the links to Michal's social media all in the description of the video, so make sure you go check that out. Aziz, what's next for you?
Well, we are doing more weekly stuff over History of Westeros. We've got our world building episodes, and then we're going to transition over to House of the Dragon, which is, less than 2 months away now. So that should be a lot of fun. And we've got quite a bit planned for that. Historical episodes, real world comparisons, guests, and all the good fun stuff that comes during a TV season.
I haven't talked about that much, but I will also be covering House of the Dragon, which I'm very excited about. But before that, you can find Aziz's links in the description of the video as well if you want to go check out all of his awesome content. And yeah, this fall's pretty exciting, huh? House of the Dragon, Andor, and Lord of the Rings all released within, I think, 2 weeks of each other. That's absolutely
and also
amazing.
She-Hulk, and also Sandman. I mean,
oh my god,
it's a lot, guys. They're trying to kill the nerds.
I'm hiring an editor for the channel. There's no way I'm going to be able to, because I want to cover both Lord of the Rings and House of the Dragon.
It's nice too that our Witcher content, not our Witcher content, but Netflix's Witcher content is mostly going to not overlap with all that. I mean, it might overlap with some of that, but most of it's later in the year or early next year. So we'll be able to have that sort of. Well, maybe. Who knows what else will get announced? But as of right now, it looks like we'll be able to have that.
Clear the table.
Focus on it without a lot of other stuff happening. So that would be nice.
Yeah, the rumor is Blood Origin Christmas time, and then Witcher season 3 is going to come out, February, March, something like that. It usually takes 6 months post-production. They got another 2-3 months of filming, so usually we'll fall around that time. Fingers crossed, nothing goes wrong. But it's an exciting time to be a fantasy nerd in general. I think we talked, of course, we talked about all the different references here. We talked like a few Star Wars references, a few Lord of the Rings ones, comparisons and stuff. And it's just a great time. We're just excited to be fans of all this, and certainly excited to be here with all of you on a Saturday night. And I want to thank all of you for watching and checking out our podcast. If you do want to go download our podcast, we're on all sorts of different platforms. Anchor.fm. Find the link in the description of the video. You can go listen on Spotify, Apple, iTunes, all that good stuff. I think there's like Pocket Cast. I think there's like 10 different versions there. It's all laid out on Anchor beautifully there for you guys. And we have over 20 episodes for you guys to go check out if you haven't checked out our podcast. So yeah. And if you do want to support us, like I said, the $1 button, $5 button, or $10 button helps us very much. And we appreciate everyone that supports the podcast. But that's going to be it for this evening. Like I said at the start of this video, thank you everyone for watching us. And we do believe in women choosing their own destiny in their own rights. I'm going to end it with that. Thank you so much, everyone. You guys have a great Saturday.